All right, today we are talking about the intersections of disability or ability and sexuality. And this is going to continue on from our conversation last week about bodies and really delve deeper into that since some of the themes and topics that we were talking about last week with bodies. So again, thinking about this intersection of sexuality and ability, we want to really take a look at some of the broader social scripts, both about disability, but also about sexuality. So when we're thinking about social scripts or narratives, stories that we're told about disability, we want to remember that these stories aren't necessarily true, but we believe them or we act as though they're true. But some of those scripts around disability we want to be aware of is this narrative that having a disability of some sort means that you have total inability in all areas of your life, that disability becomes a master narrative, a thing that takes over your entire identity, or sometimes what is sometimes called a globalized identity. And this sort of stems from other narratives about bodies and broken bodies, which we talked about last week. But this idea that if you are quote unquote broken or not functioning in a way that we assume a normative, able bodied person, their body should function, we sort of globalize that to mean that you're broken entirely. So if you have a physical, mobility challenge, perhaps you use a wheelchair or some other mobility device, we sort of assume that that means you are also incapable of doing basically anything for yourself, whether that's physical, whether that's mental, whether that's emotional, and certainly sexual. We also have narratives around aging and sort of natural aging processes as a form of being disabled. And for many people, that's not the case. But we also have a very prominent social script that you'll hear about time and again today about the fact that people with disabilities aren't sexual, or the story that people with disabilities aren't sexual. In addition to social scripts about disability, we also have some of these social scripts about good or appropriate sex that we've been talking about throughout the course, and how those map onto folks who have disabilities. And our standard narratives of what sexuality even looks like, or what sex looks like, doesn't usually include people with disabilities. One of the things that we focus on or think about in terms of sex is a person who is a sexual person is somebody that has an able body. We can also think about the ableist sexual culture that we have, which are these scripts and ideas about where and how appropriate sex happens, and what that looks like, how people need to be able to move or where that should be happening. We can also think about scripts around shame, and the way in which shame has worked as a form of social control to push people or incentivize these scripts and narratives about what good or appropriate sex is. And that because of someone's disability, they might require some sort of prop or assistance that might push the way that they have sex into those sort of outer limits, as Gail Rubin might say, of acceptability. So bringing in devices of various sorts, bringing in an attendant if necessary, so bringing in a third person or multiple parties. And so all of these things connect together to basically exclude folks with disabilities from what we might call sexual citizenship, or from being considered both fully human but also having full access to the rights of sexual expression. So how are folks with disabilities excluded through these social scripts to the full rights of sexual expression that able-bodied people are considered to have? Of course, it's always possible to resist or try to rewrite these scripts, and that's an important thing to be thinking about, and certainly many folks with disabilities and allies to disability communities are doing this work and are trying to resist and rewrite this script, and some of the videos that you'll see for this week are examples of how folks are doing that. But when we're thinking about resisting or rewriting the scripts, there's a few aspects or pieces that are pretty big challenges that need to be taken into account, which is not to say they're insurmountable, but certainly need to be considered. And the first thing is certainly just the vast amount of diversity within the disability community. So we can think about diversity not just in the fact that folks with disabilities come from all sorts of backgrounds in terms of race or ethnicity or gender or religious affiliation or class or any of those intersecting identities, but also just even within thinking about disability as a construct, folks who have physical disabilities versus folks who have cognitive-based disabilities, or some folks might even have a combination of those. Thinking about the time and the origin of the disability, is it something that was naturally occurring, something that somebody was born with, or is it a result of an accident or injury? Is it something that happened later in life as a process of aging, or something that was happening with their body? Certainly thinking about the fact that folks with disabilities come from a variety of sexual identities, so they might identify as LGBTQ, they might identify as heterosexual or something else. That the sexual preferences and desires of people with disabilities are going to be just as varied and diverse and nuanced as folks without disabilities. So some folks might be interested in specific types of sex, or having more or less of it, or not having it at all. And all of those things are valuable and important to be thinking about. A theme that has arisen, certainly when talking about bodies, but I think throughout the course, is this idea of communication and consent, and then also logistics when bodies don't necessarily conform to what we assume the sort of quote-unquote normal body should be able to do, that the logistics of sex that are the easy scripts and actions that we sort of think about in terms of what sexuality mean might be more complicated if someone is not able to participate in the things that we think of as the sort of traditional sexual behaviors. But that also might be logistics in terms of, do you need a pharmaceutical aid? Do you need an attendant? Do you need any particular equipment to support your ability to be a fully sexual human being? We can also think about the way in which fully including folks with disability as sexual citizens is going to require, at least to some extent, a remapping of what we might call sexual geography. And we're thinking here both about spatial geography, so like where people have sex. Is it in the bedroom? Is it in their own home? Is it outside? Is it in, if somebody is in a facility such as a hospital or a long-term care facility, where are the spaces both in which people have sex, but also we think about as being sexual spaces, and some of the narratives of like long walks on the beach being romantic and sexual. Well, if you are in a wheelchair, it's probably very difficult to be on the beach because sand is not an easy thing to drive over. And so thinking about the way in which we need to remap some of the geographies, both literal and figurative geographies of sex and sexuality. But also thinking about remapping the sexual geography of the body. We have, again, we talked about that genital-centric understanding of sexuality that we often have, and that folks with disabilities may have other parts of their body or need to remap their body in some way, or remap our understanding of the body, the social understanding of the body, as to what parts are sexual and or intimate or arousing. Linked to this is a need to blur what is already a blurry boundary, but we sort of pretend is not, the boundary between public and private. So sexuality, as Gail Rubin sort of showed us in her circle, her charmed circle, is intended to be private, or thought that it should be private. But really, like, what is private and what is public? And especially if you are in a hospital for any period of time, or in an assisted living facility, your public and private are very blurry. You don't necessarily have a lot of privacy, but also the sense of the perception of what is appropriate for people to ask about, certainly with marginalized communities, can often blur that public-private boundary. And certainly things like pornography and other things, thinking about the way in which the public and the private are not always One of our readings today for this week also talks about the sort of pushing the boundaries of mainstream sex, understandings of sex or pornography, but the blurry boundary between pushing that understanding that we have and fetishization. And so wanting to also be mindful of the way that as we are opening up opportunities and including folks with disabilities as full sexual citizens, we are not then fetishizing the disability at the expense of the person in a dehumanizing sort of way. And that can often be a tricky boundary and something that needs to be negotiated for each individual person. So moving forward, thinking about what we need to do, one of the things I would argue that needs to happen is we need to reframe narratives around disability more broadly to include the fact, or to correct for the fact, that disability is not a defect but is a really complex embodiment, and is not necessarily as grounded in the physical body or in the brain or the mind as we think it is, but really is a social construction and a social understanding. And to really think about persons with disabilities as sexual beings and as sexual citizens. At the same time, sort of coming at it from another angle, we also need to reframe those narratives around sexuality more broadly, really challenging what the standard or normative ideas of what counts as good or appropriate sex, and possibly even reframing what counts as sex. Again, getting back to that definitional question, which has also become a theme throughout the course. And so one of the things you might think about as you're going through the readings and through the videos for this week is to think about, how do we even do this? How do we start to reframe these narratives, either about disability or about sexuality or about both and the intersections there? And how are some folks already doing this work? So looking forward to hearing your thoughts and responses this week, as always, and we'll see you again next week.